Welcome to the Bill of Rights presentation. Make sure you take notes in Cornell note format. I'm going to go through each amendment, so your cues on the left could be the title of the amendment or the number, and on the right hand side put your notes, and feel free to add some drawings as well. So first of all, why do we have these amendments? Well, first of all, Virginia and New York wanted to have a Bill of Rights to protect the citizens from the federal government, and they called for it in order to ratify the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights were actually added before the Constitution was completely ratified. And they were designed to protect basic freedoms of American citizens. Some people say that it tells you what the government is not allowed to do and what they're allowed to do in regards to the rights of states as well as citizens. And it's usually interpreted by the courts. After the 1930s, we see a move towards individual rights from the Supreme Court. And the First Amendment is what we all know as freedom of speech. And it begins with the Establishment Clause, and it states that the government cannot establish a religion, and that there has to be a wall of separation between church and state. Next, it also mentions the Free Exercise Clause, which means that you are allowed to practice your religion, or if you don't practice a religion, you're allowed to do that too. And lastly, that you have freedom of speech, that the federal government cannot limit your speech or your right to speak out, but there are certain exceptions to it, and that is libel and slander, which we'll talk about next. The First Amendment also establishes a freedom of the press, that the federal government cannot stop publication of news. Now, this doesn't apply to people like bloggers or, that type of thing. It applies specifically to journalists. And it also states the right to assembly, that you have the right to peaceably protest. Now, peaceably means that you might have to get a permit, that you are not violent, that you're not rioting, those types of things. And lastly, it also gives you the right to petition the government, to give complaints to or suggestions to the government, usually through your representative, or you can, again, do this through protesting. But it's important to remember that the First Amendment is a privilege, not specifically a right, and there are certain limits. Specifically, like I mentioned, libel and slander earlier. So if you're telling lies about someone publicly that could ruin their reputation or ruin their career, you would be held responsible for those words. Also, rioting is not protesting. Those are two different actions. Protesting means you're peaceful, you're not, causing bodily harm to anyone, and you're also not destroying property. So those are some of the limits to the First Amendment. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. So first, it establishes a militia, and it is a right for the states and the people to have a militia. But separately from this, it states that the federal government cannot infringe on your right to own weapons, meaning it can't completely eradicate it. Now, there are limits to the types of weapons we may use and how we can obtain those weapons, such as background checks or semi-automatic weapons, those types of things. But you have the right to defend yourself with some type of weapon. The Third Amendment, which is basically in reference to the Quartering Act, so it states that we cannot be forced to house soldiers in our home, and especially we shouldn't be forced to do this during peacetime. Now, some people talk about repealing the Third Amendment because they feel that we as citizens should be more responsible for our troops, so that's a debate somewhat going on in our country as well. The Fourth Amendment, the idea that you have to have a warrant. So this is kind of where we get our right to privacy. You have the right to secure or defend yourself, your house, your papers, and any effects from search and seizure. So search and seizure means that the federal government, and by extension the police of the government, cannot search your house or take anything, or search your body or take anything without reasonable suspicion or a warrant. Now, you need a warrant to search, but you have to have probable cause. So there must be some type of description of the item that the police need, or the specific place that the police plan on searching. And they can't just search because that they want to. They have to show probable cause to a judge who signs off on a warrant. Now, a lot of people have debated, do we still have these protections with some of the Homeland Security laws and that type of stuff? So that's the Fourth Amendment is another amendment in debate right now in our country. Our Fifth Amendment, the right to hide behind the Fifth, or I plead the Fifth. So these are amendments specifically targeted towards criminals, the next few. So first, that it establishes due process, that you have to go through the courts to take away anyone's life, liberty, or property. So when we go to jail, our liberty is taken away. So you have to go through due process to achieve that goal. Also, it establishes that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice, which is double jeopardy. So the prosecutor only gets one chance to try a case and prove that you were guilty. Now, if there's a mistrial, they get a second chance, but if you are found not guilty, they can't try you again. And lastly, the idea of self-incrimination. I plead the Fifth. So you can't share testimony if you don't want to that could make yourself look guilty or incriminate yourself. It's your choice to say, I plead the Fifth. And lastly, it also establishes the idea of eminent domain. So if the government, and by extension the city, wants your land for public use, they must pay you a fair price for it. So as you can see, there's a giant hammer coming into the house of private property, and local governments are kind of using the Supreme Court to have the right to that private property. Next is the Sixth Amendment, and this is where we get our Miranda rights from. So first of all, you're entitled to a trial by a jury of your peers, and that jury must be impartial. They can't have prejudice against you. So during the Civil Rights era and during the Jim Crow era, we saw issues with a jury of one's peers, when a lot of African Americans were tried by all-white juries who were obviously prejudiced to them. And so this was a huge issue in our country, but it's now resolved, thank goodness. And the rights of the accused. So you have the right to be told what you're being accused of, your crime, have access to a lawyer, and be allowed to call witnesses to defend yourself. And confrontation clause, that you are allowed to question the witnesses against you. Now, some issues arise, so say for example, if the witness is in protective custody, or the witness maybe has died, there are other ways of using their testimony, but sometimes a lot of defense lawyers argue that it violates the Sixth Amendment because their defendant doesn't have the right to question the witnesses. And also the Sixth Amendment establishes the right to a speedy and public trial. Now some people may say that, well, 2 years or a year and a half later is not really speedy, but in other countries, you're just held for years at a time before you receive a trial. So in reality, our justice system actually does move pretty quickly. And the Seventh Amendment. Now this is involving civil trials. So if you have a conflict over money, so say that you're owed money by someone, or a deal falls through, or what have you, anything worth more than $20, which sounds like really trivial now, but was worth a lot of money then, it will be presented to a jury. So it can't just be, solved behind closed doors. Although you have that option to work together with the other party to come to a settlement. And the Eighth Amendment, there shall be no excessive bail, so you can't have an excessive amount of money or requirements to get out of jail while you await your trial. And there should be no cruel and unusual punishment if you are convicted of a crime. Now, a lot of people argue that the death penalty can be defined as cruel and unusual, but other people argue that it fits the crime and it's in no way outside the realm of possibility if you commit murder or certain other crimes. So it's another debate that goes on within our country as well. And the Ninth and 10th Amendment. These two amendments basically say that any rights not mentioned are still protected. So if the framers and the writers of the Bill of Rights forgot to mention something, then those are still protected as well. So for example, the right to privacy, that is still protected even though it's not specifically, the word is not mentioned. And the 10th Amendment, if power is not given to the government and not prohibited, meaning the states can't do it, then the states or the people have the power. So for example, education. Education is not mentioned in the Constitution as the responsibility of the federal government, and it doesn't say that the states can't establish schools. So we can assume therefore that the states have the power to establish schools. Okay, so good luck with the rest of your assignments, and I will see you later. Bye.